My story begins in a quiet suburb where I spent my childhood dreaming of a bright future in the business world. I had a fascination with technology, convinced it held the power to solve life's little annoyances. After college, I threw myself into building a startup that specialized in cutting-edge surveillance equipment. The business thrived, and landing our first major contract with the Department of Defense opened the door to a string of lucrative deals. As my career soared, I met Emily at a networking event. She was an accountant with a sharp wit and a laugh that could light up a room. It didn't take long for us to fall head over heels, and within a year, we were married. 2 years later, our daughter Sophie came into our lives, filling our home with laughter and love. But as my work demands grew, I failed to notice the cracks forming in my marriage. Reality hit like a freight train after our divorce, leaving me as the primary caretaker of our 3-year-old daughter. Looking back, the signs had been there all along, but I'd ignored them. The real wake-up call came at my grandfather's funeral. His sudden heart attack forced me to confront the things I'd been avoiding. The day after the funeral, I was packing up our things at my mom's house. As I strapped Sophie into her car seat, I asked, "Sweetheart, do you want to take off your shoes?" Her predictable little "yes, please" made me smile, as it always did. I gently removed her tiny Mary Jane shoes and socks, knowing she loved the freedom of bare feet. She wriggled her toes, and I couldn't resist tickling them, eliciting a burst of giggles. It was our little game, one that never failed to brighten my day. I noticed something during moments like this. Sophie and I were spending more time together, and we both treasured it. But with Emily, it wasn't the same anymore. Just as I started to dwell on that thought, Sophie interrupted my reverie. "Daddy," she asked as I placed her shoes and socks neatly on the seat beside her. "What's on your mind, pumpkin?" I asked, turning to meet her big, questioning eyes. After a pause, she dropped the question that stopped me cold. "Why doesn't Mommy love us anymore?" Her innocent words hit me like a sucker punch, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. Finally, I managed, "Honey, Mommy loves you very much. She loves us both." A flicker of hope brightened her face but quickly faded. "Then why didn't she say goodbye to Grandpa?" she asked, her voice tinged with sadness. I repeated what Emily had told me. "She had to work, sweetheart," I said, though the excuse felt hollow even to me. "She works a lot," Sophie said quietly. I struggled to explain Emily's late nights in a way a 3-year-old could understand. "She's just finishing up a big project, baby," I assured her. "She'll have more time for us soon." I buckled her in, kissed her forehead, and closed the door. 20 minutes into the drive home, Sophie had fallen asleep, but her words kept echoing in my mind. By the time we pulled into the driveway at sunset, I was weighed down by dark thoughts. Emily was home, as she'd promised, but something felt off. Sophie ran ahead, eager to share stories about the cousins she'd met at the funeral. I followed her upstairs, where I found Emily sitting at her vanity, wearing nothing but her underwear and applying makeup. She greeted me with a quick peck on the cheek, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time she'd kissed me with passion. Sophie chatted excitedly, but Emily barely acknowledged her. Even our daughter noticed and eventually wandered off to her room. Emily continued fixing her hair, ignoring the moment. "What's going on, Emily?" I asked, my voice tight with frustration. "What do you mean?" she replied without looking up, her tone dismissive. "We've been home 10 minutes, and you're already rushing to go out?" I pressed. She sighed impatiently. "You know I go out with the girls on Fridays," she said as if reciting a script. "Fridays?" I scoffed. "You're out on Saturdays too, and most Wednesdays. Honestly, Emily, it feels like you're out more than you're home." I closed the bedroom door to keep Sophie from overhearing. Emily stood up, looking at me with an expression that bordered on indifference. Taking her hands in mine, I said, "Sophie asked me something today. She wanted to know why you don't love us anymore. I need to ask you the same thing." Her eyes narrowed, but I pressed on. "Do you even love me, Emily?" She hesitated before leaning into me, softening her voice. "Of course, darling. I love you more today than ever." But her words rang hollow. She didn't look happy, and I wasn't convinced. "Then stay home tonight," I said, trying to keep my tone steady. "Let's spend some time together." We can put Sophie to bed early, open a bottle of wine, and relax. For a moment, she seemed to consider it, but when I mentioned the black lace camisole I'd bought her for Valentine's Day, she pulled away. I held her wrists firmly. "Emily," I said, my voice steady but low, "are you cheating on me?" Her face betrayed her. A flicker in her eyes, a tightness at the corners. Her pulse quickened under my fingers, confirming what I already suspected. "Don't be ridiculous," she said lightly, brushing it off. "I could never love anyone but you." She kissed my neck, careful not to smudge her makeup, but the chill I felt in that moment was unmistakable. Patting my arm, she glanced at the clock. "I'm going to be late," she said. "I promised the girls I wouldn't be." "We need time together, Emily," I said firmly, my patience wearing thin. "Tell them you'll go another time," I said, my voice strained. "Spend tonight with us, please." Emily barely glanced at me as she pulled away and rummaged through the closet, pulling out a short skirt. "I can't just bail on my friends," she retorted, her tone sharp. "Why would you even want me to? Why would you want to disappoint me and your daughter?" I shot back, my frustration bubbling over. "Don't we matter to you anymore?" Her eyes narrowed, her anger bubbling to the surface. "I told you tomorrow," she snapped. "I'm entitled to some time for myself without you hovering over me. I'm not your slave, John." The argument escalated from there. Emily doubled down, insisting she had every right to her independence. She claimed that her nights out were essential for unwinding after work. I reminded her how much space I'd always given her, how I'd supported her career without hesitation, even when she chose to return to work after Sophie was born. It wasn't like we needed her income to live comfortably. My earnings had us covered, but I couldn't understand why her job and social life always seemed to come before our family. When I got sarcastic about her so-called girls' nights, she bristled even more. "What exactly are you accusing me of?" she demanded. Rather than risk saying something I'd regret, I stormed out, retreating to the couch to cool off. I sat there, wrestling with the urge to confront her again, but knowing it wouldn't help. When she finally came downstairs, dressed to leave, I had calmed down enough to try one last time. "Emily," I said, my voice deeper, almost pleading, "please don't do this." She hesitated for a moment, standing by the door, but then she opened it. "Emily," I repeated, more firmly this time, "I love you. Please don't do this to me and Sophie." She turned back, her expression unreadable. Without a word, she stepped outside and closed the door behind her. Sophie, hearing the door, came running downstairs. She opened it, just in time to see her mother's car disappear down the street. Quietly, she shut the door, then walked over to me. Climbing onto the couch, she nestled into my side, her little face staring at the door as if willing Emily to return. After a long moment, Sophie curled up in my lap, and we hugged in silence. Eventually, I carried her into the kitchen, deciding sandwiches would make for a simple dinner. The weekend passed tensely between Emily and me. She stumbled an early Saturday morning, hungover and irritable. Sophie and I tiptoed around her bad mood all day. By the afternoon, I'd had enough. I took Sophie to the park, and we stayed out until well past dinner. When we got home, Emily was waiting, visibly furious. "So now you're abandoning me," she snapped. I stared at her, unable to hide my disdain. "You brought this on yourself, Emily," I said coldly. "You abandoned Sophie first. Get used to us spending time together without you, and deal with it like an adult." She seemed stunned by my tone and didn't say another word. For the rest of the evening, she focused her attention on Sophie, trying to make up for her absence. That night, I tried to bridge the gap, hoping for some intimacy. But Emily, complaining of an upset stomach, brushed me off. The following evening, she was completely unresponsive, and I gave up again, opting for a long shower to clear my head. By Monday morning, I decided to shake things up. I left the house before Emily even woke, forcing her to handle Sophie's morning routine. It was something she hated doing, and for once, I wanted her to experience some of the responsibility I shouldered daily. Before leaving, I activated the surveillance equipment I'd installed in the basement. The system, while technically a gray area legally, gave me peace of mind. It recorded phone calls and intercepted cellular activity within a 150-foot radius. We'd initially set it up to monitor babysitters and the housekeeper, operating under a trust but verified policy. While it had proven unnecessary for them, I found myself wondering if it might now serve a different purpose. As I pulled into the secure parking lot of my company's campus, surrounded by tall chain-link fencing topped with razor wire, my thoughts were clouded with suspicion. 3 years ago, we'd installed the fencing after landing our first major Department of Defense contract, and 2 more lucrative deals had followed since then. I parked, grabbed my Palm Pilot and briefcase, and glanced at the company logo on the wall. My Industries. At 34, I was the CEO and president of a steadily growing enterprise. What had started 12 years ago as a tool manufacturing business had evolved into a niche provider of surveillance technology. We gained a strong reputation for our motor mounts and compact cameras with advanced zoom capabilities, becoming a trusted name among private investigators. Over time, we expanded into full-service surveillance, acquiring several PI agencies and establishing branches in 3 cities under the banner of Information and Surveillance Associates. Despite our success, we kept a low profile, quietly flourishing in the background. In my office, I signed off on routine documents, relying on Susan, my sharp-as-a-tack secretary, to handle the details. Susan was more than an employee. She'd been a rock since the company's early days, a confidant and a second mother figure. I'd even bumped her salary to match those of our vice presidents, a fact she knew but never flaunted. When she brought me my first cup of coffee, I stopped her. "Susan, could you ask James Fletcher to swing by?" "Sure," she said, looking curious. "Should I tell him why?" I hesitated before nodding. "Just let him know I need to become a customer," I said carefully. Her expression softened. "I'm so sorry, John," she said quietly, leaving the room without further questions. James, head of our surveillance and investigations division, showed up a few minutes later. Closing the door, he sat across from me, sipping his tea as I struggled to find the words. "James," I began, choosing each word carefully, "I think Emily's getting into something she shouldn't." James groaned, shaking his head. "Ah, crap, John," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "I'm sorry to hear that," James said, his voice low as we sat in silence for a moment. He set his mug down, thinking. "Well," he began after a pause, "we've got what we need to get to the bottom of this. I'll bring in temps to free up our best people. I'll need her work schedule, cell number, credit card info, anything relevant." I nodded, already prepared. I'd spent Sunday gathering Emily's account numbers and details, a task that had left me feeling torn between guilt and necessity. While I hesitated at first about using our in-house team, James's insistence on involving the best convinced me. I handed over the information, and James set me up as an official client of our surveillance division, Information and Surveillance Associates. We used my personal checking account to keep things off the books. James outlined a plan to track Emily, where she went, who she was with, and what they were doing. I hated spying on my wife, but after the weekend's hurtful revelations and her growing emotional distance, I needed answers. If it turned out there was no betrayal, she'd never have to know, and maybe we could even try counseling. But if she was unfaithful, I had to know. By noon, James's team had bugged Emily's Lexus, parked at her downtown office. Using my spare key, they installed a microphone under the driver's seat and a GPS tracker in the trunk. James assigned his top agents to the case, supplementing them with rental cars to keep things discreet. He even hired a freelancer to start at Emily's accounting firm the following week, posing as a new hire. "Let us handle this, John," James advised. "You need to keep things normal with Emily." The fact that James spoke so routinely about uncovering infidelity hit me hard. This wasn't new for him. It was just another case. He left me with a choice: disrupt the affair if there was one, or gather evidence for divorce. I chose to disrupt. I wasn't ready to give up on my wife. That evening, after Sophie went to bed, I called James from the basement. My hands trembled as I dialed. James picked up on the second ring. "What's going on?" he asked, concern in his voice. "You remember the intercepts we installed when the house was built?" I asked. "Yeah," he replied. "Sorry, we couldn't set up the remote monitoring today." "No problem," I said, my voice tight. But I recorded something tonight. Emily and a guy named David. He told her he couldn't wait to screw her brains out again. The words caught in my throat as I repeated them. My chest hurt, and my hands felt numb. James was silent for a moment. "John, I'm so sorry," he said finally. "It's on her," I said, swallowing hard. "Sophie and I are the ones who'll suffer for this." I took a shaky breath. "This changes things. Tomorrow, I'm calling Tom to start the divorce process. We'll need to collect evidence." Tom Peterson, my lawyer, had handled both personal and business matters for me for years. "You're sure about this?" James asked. "I have no choice," I replied. "I'll see you tomorrow at the office." "Take it easy tonight," he said carefully. "Don't do anything rash." "I'm fine," I lied. "But I won't be sleeping with her again. I'll make up an excuse, but I can't be near her after this." "That's fine," James said reassuringly. "It might take a little longer, but trust me, people who cheat think they're untouchable. They're predictable." I stayed quiet, unable to feel reassured. "Hang in there, John," James added. "You'll get through this." "Sure," I said, though I didn't believe it. All I could see was pain, mine and Sophie's. That night, I slept in the guest room, claiming I had a sore throat that might make me snore. Emily barely reacted, agreeing without a second thought. When I added that I wanted to stay closer to Sophie, who'd been struggling with bedwetting, Emily shrugged and returned to her magazine, indifferent. The next day, James gave me his first report. Emily's lover was David Harper, an accounting executive at her firm. Like Emily, he was a division supervisor. He was married with 2 kids, a 9-year-old son and a 7-year-old daughter. His wife, Linda, worked part-time in insurance. David was 38, taller but slimmer than me. In the photo James found, he looked like a runner. Nothing exceptional, but apparently enough for Emily to risk everything. James's team dug deeper, bribing a contact at the phone company to access 2 years of Emily's call records. The pattern was clear. A handful of calls at first, increasing to weekly about 6 months ago, and now daily, often late at night or early in the morning. The pieces were coming together, and the truth hit harder with every detail. James noted that Emily and David often talked during times I wasn't around, either after I left for work or when I was in the basement lifting weights. "Do you remember anything significant that happened around the time their calls spiked?" James asked, his professional tone making the weight of the conversation slightly easier to bear. I leaned back, sifting through my memories. "She went to a training seminar in Chicago a couple of weeks before the calls increased," I said slowly. "I remember driving her to the airport. David was there too, boarding the same flight." James nodded, making a note. "That seminar seems to be the starting point. Too many details are aligning to ignore it." "I don't believe in coincidences either," I muttered, the pieces falling into place in my mind. James flipped through his notepad. "We've got digital copies of all her credit card transactions from the past year, thanks to your joint accounts. Today, we'll dig into your bank records as well and let you know what we find." I was impressed by how much information James's team had uncovered in just a couple of days. "How'd you manage to get all of that without my authorization?" I asked, wondering if I should be alarmed at how easily sensitive information had been accessed. James gave me a sly grin. "You did authorize it, boss," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "You know that stack of paperwork Susan hands you to sign?" James chuckled. "It was in there. You trust her with everything, don't you?" I couldn't help but laugh. "Used to trust my wife the same way," I replied bitterly. "Now Susan's got the top spot." "Smart move," James quipped before turning back to his notes. By Thursday, James's team had compiled a mountain of evidence. 2 investigators sent to Chicago tracked down seminar attendees and hotel staff who remembered Emily and David clearly. Several witnesses described them as very close, with one desk clerk mistaking them for a married couple until he noticed their different last names. Hotel staff recalled them as frequent visitors to the lounge, where they drank heavily and behaved so inappropriately that the lounge manager had to ask them to tone it down. Afterward, they were seen stumbling to their rooms together in the early hours of the morning. James's team was negotiating with the hotel to see if security camera footage from that week was still available. It would likely require a substantial under-the-table payment, but I didn't mind. I wanted everything we could get. Meanwhile, the freelance operative placed at Emily's office had started earlier than planned. Within days, they confirmed that Emily and David were widely known to be an item. Their boss was aware of the affair and had warned them to keep it out of the workplace, but it hadn't stopped them. Emily's conduct had already cost her a merit increase due to poor performance, a note I filed away for my attorney. It suggested a lack of enforcement of company policies. James's team uncovered even more damning evidence from payroll records. Emily and David had been taking off 1 or 2 afternoons a week, most likely for their rendezvous. Credit card statements revealed that Emily was paying for nearly all the motel stays. It was humiliating to see how cheap and tasteless their affair was. David wasn't just betraying his family, but he was doing it on Emily's dime. Emily's so-called friends from her Friday night outings proved easy to crack. Most of them, a group of single or recently divorced women, were quick to divulge information for a $100 bribe. They shared dates, locations, and details of Emily and David's meetups. Many admitted they hadn't seen Emily in months. Her supposed nights out with them had been cover stories. One friend, Debbie, reacted differently. Furious at being questioned, she immediately called Emily to warn her that someone was investigating. Debbie, known for her own troubled past, seemed to be encouraging Emily's behavior. Twice divorced for infidelity and notorious for seducing married men, Debbie had a reputation that preceded her. Somehow, despite not working in the same office, she had become part of Emily's social circle, adding fuel to the fire. James reassured me that they had taken precautions to keep things under control. His team had cloned Emily's cell phone, allowing them to intercept her messages and conversations. Meanwhile, the bribes kept her other friends quiet. They assured Emily they hadn't told anyone anything, leaving her only vaguely aware that questions were being asked. I was astonished at the sheer volume and quality of information James's team had gathered. Emily and David were amateurs at keeping secrets. James's team were seasoned professionals. The two of them didn't stand a chance. At home, things remained tense. Emily canceled most of her weeknight outings, keeping only her Friday plans. James's team confirmed that those nights still involved dancing at clubs, though David no longer joined her. Instead, he stayed home with his family, a change that hadn't gone unnoticed by his wife. One report suggested Linda, David's wife, was growing suspicious of his sudden shift in habits. Despite the investigators' questions rattling Emily and her friends, the effect was disappointingly short-lived. Within 3 weeks, Emily and David seemed to believe the worst had passed. Their late-night phone conversations grew more frequent and increasingly explicit, as though they thought I was oblivious. During this time, I almost completely moved into the guest bedroom. I couldn't bring myself to kiss Emily, let alone sleep with her, no matter how many hints she dropped. I read every book in Sophie's small library and bought more, spending every possible moment with her. To keep up the pretense, I faked a dry, persistent cough, using it as an excuse to sleep away from Emily. She didn't question it. In fact, she barely seemed to notice. James's team kept me updated. The pattern of phone calls and secret meetups continued to intensify. By the third Wednesday, Emily and David had arranged another meeting at their usual cheap motel. The evidence was piling up, but with every piece, my heart broke a little more. James's team was primed for action, and Tom, my attorney, had prepared me for what was to come. That evening, I arranged for Mandy, the 16-year-old neighbor, to babysit Sophie. I stood in the living room as Emily prepared to leave, my heart heavy but resolute. "Emily," I said, my voice soft but firm, "please don't go out tonight." She glanced at me with mild irritation, then sighed. "John," she began sharply but quickly softened, her tone shifting to one of feigned patience. "Look, nothing is going on. I'm just going out for drinks and maybe some dancing. That's all." Her expression was calm, convincing, even affectionate as she hugged me. "Emily," I said impulsively, "I know you're meeting someone tonight." She pulled back slightly, her brow furrowing. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her indignation tinged with suspicion. "I just know," I said quietly. "You're cheating on me and Sophie, and it's not fair." Her body relaxed slightly, as though she believed I only had vague suspicions. "John," she said firmly, "I am not cheating on you. I've told you this before. I'm tired of these accusations. Keep this up, and I might actually find someone to take care of my needs." Her words hit me like a slap, and I looked away to hide my anger. "Emily," I said through clenched teeth, "don't do this." "Not another word," she snapped. "I have never cheated on you. I am not now, and I never will. Does that satisfy you?" Before I could respond, she strode to the door, pulling on a light jacket. I noticed she wasn't wearing a bra, and her miniskirt revealed no panty lines. "Emily," I said more calmly, "if you ever cheat on me, our marriage is over. Remember what we talked about when Georgia and Sam split up last year?" Her hand paused on the doorknob for a moment. Then, without looking back, she said in a controlled but condescending tone, "I swear, I don't want anyone but you, and I never will." With that, she opened the door and left. 20 minutes later, I joined James and 3 of his top operatives in a room adjacent to where David and Emily would soon meet. Spooked by my protests and recent questioning of Emily's friends, David and Emily had driven around aimlessly for a while, checking for tails. The GPS trackers in their cars confirmed no one was following them. James grinned slightly. "They're amateurs," he said. "We don't need to follow them when we already know the destination." A desk clerk at the motel had been paid to alert James's team of their reservation, so tracking wasn't necessary. Shortly after I arrived, Emily and David pulled into the motel parking lot within minutes of each other, stopping in front of room 113. They didn't notice the dark van across the street, its cameras recording every move. We watched as they embraced and kissed passionately outside the door, oblivious to the surveillance. My fists clenched, and James glanced at me. "John," he said quietly, "it's going to get worse. Can you handle this?" I sat down heavily on one of the beds, feeling my lips dry and my stomach churn. "Got anything to drink?" I asked. James misunderstood, shaking his head. "Here," he said, handing me a small yellow pill. "Take this Valium. It'll help you stay calm." I accepted it and grabbed a soda from the cooler James had brought. Inside the motel room, a high-end digital camera, hidden in the air conditioning vent, captured everything. Its zoom lens and full-color capabilities ensured nothing would be missed. James's operatives worked efficiently, positioning fiber-optic cameras under the door and above it, their tiny lenses undetectable in the darkness. To ensure complete invisibility, they unscrewed the nearby outdoor light bulb before returning inside. On the monitors, the scene unfolded. Emily shed her dress within seconds, revealing she had, as suspected, worn nothing underneath. David quickly followed suit, and the two fell onto the bed. The act itself was devoid of intimacy. No tenderness or foreplay, just crude, mechanical movements. "Damn," I muttered after a minute, my voice thick with anger and disgust. "That guy's no bigger than me. Hell, he's smaller." Emily had often praised me during our marriage, affectionately calling out for my big tool in the early years of our relationship. Watching David's awkward, fumbling performance, I couldn't understand what she saw in him. One of James's agents, Sherry, glanced at me briefly, then at the screen. She smirked and shook her head slightly, as if to agree with my assessment. I caught a hint of something speculative in her eyes before we both quickly looked away. Sherry was attractive, and the moment gave me a fleeting thought about possibilities for the future, but I pushed it aside. There was nothing more to see. The evidence was captured. Emily and David's betrayal laid bare. I left soon after, unable to stomach any more. Over the following week, Emily and David struggled to align their schedules, leaving them frustrated. They didn't meet again until Debbie, the meddling friend, suggested a trip to Las Vegas. James's team had plenty of dirt on Debbie, painting her as a spiteful, manipulative woman estranged from her family due to past infidelities. In a monitored phone call, Debbie floated the idea to Emily, claiming she'd won 2 free tickets to Vegas and inviting her along. Debbie seemed to revel in stirring the pot, encouraging Emily's affair without hesitation. Her actions only added to the growing pile of evidence against both Emily and her lover. It was clear Debbie's plan for a girls-only weekend in Vegas was a thinly veiled excuse to meet men. She even joked on a recorded call about bringing along 24 rubbers, ensuring she was prepared for any encounter. Emily agreed to the trip but invited David, throwing Debbie's plans into disarray. Debbie wasn't thrilled about the change, but she didn't object outright when she realized Emily wouldn't budge. True to form, David complained about having to pay his own way. His stinginess was on full display, as he expected Emily to cover his costs. This cheap behavior underscored how little he valued her beyond the affair. Tom, my lawyer, took special note of Debbie's involvement. She knowingly facilitated the trip, aware that both Emily and David were married. Tom planned to subpoena Debbie as part of the divorce proceedings. While he doubted we could win any damages from her, the goal was to scare her enough to stop her from wrecking anyone else's marriage in the future. As we debated whether to confront Emily with the motel footage or wait until after the Vegas trip, Tom urged patience. The out-of-state trip, he explained, with all the lies and deceit it involves, will make an even stronger case. It'll show blatant disrespect for your marriage vows. Though I wanted to end the charade immediately, Tom convinced me to wait. James's team was ready. They booked a room in the same casino hotel as Debbie, David, and Emily, securing a location with a direct line of sight into their room. A well-placed $500 bribe ensured Emily's room was conveniently located on that side of the building. James's cameras were set up, equipped to capture every angle. James explained that people in high-rise hotels often feel invisible, assuming no one can see them from the ground. Even if they decided to close the shades, James's team was prepared with a laser microphone capable of capturing sound vibrations from the window. Every word would be recorded with clarity. Additionally, Tom had written a script for me to call Emily during the trip, pleading with her to come home. It was a calculated move to show her complete disregard for our marriage and family. I sat at home, connected to James's setup, watching the live feed. My emotions swung wildly between anger and despair. I was physically ill, unable to eat as the events unfolded. On the plane to Vegas, David and Emily had nearly emptied the airline's supply of mini liquor bottles, leaving them visibly drunk when they arrived. That evening, I made the call. Emily was on her knees and elbows on the bed as David took her from behind. She contorted her body to reach the phone on the nightstand, her face flushed with both exertion and drunkenness. Debbie, sitting nearby, laughed and cheered them on. "Emily," I said, my voice trembling, "please, honey, don't do this. Come home to me. We can work this out." Emily's head jerked toward the phone, her expression a mix of irritation and mockery. "Screw you," she screamed. "I've told you before, you stupid crap, I am not having sex with anyone." I shook my head in disbelief. How could she spew such lies while actively betraying me? Her words were as vile as her actions. I pressed on, desperate. "Emily, think of Sophie. Think of what this will do to her." She laughed cruelly, her tone venomous. "I might just pick up some creep tonight and bring him back here. How's that, honey? Would you like that? Would that make you happy, you pathetic piece of crap?" Her words cut deeper than any knife, and I sat frozen, unable to speak. This was the same woman I'd held through sleepless nights, the same woman who had cried in my arms after losing her aunt. That version of Emily felt like a distant memory. "Emily," I said weakly, "I don't know why you're doing this. Think of Sophie." "Go to hell," she shrieked. "Take her with you." She hurled the phone against the wall, shattering the last vestiges of my hope. Moments later, she motioned for David to continue, resuming their affair as if the call had never happened. By Sunday morning, James and his team dismantled the operation, packed up their equipment, and flew home. They had more evidence than I ever imagined possible: videos, photos, phone transcripts, financial records, and eyewitness accounts. Tom was overwhelmed but confident. "We'll file for divorce by noon Monday," he promised. Among the evidence was vivid footage of Emily with David, captured through an open window. It was entirely legal and admissible in court. Added to this were recordings from my home surveillance system, which showed Emily's indifference toward Sophie. One video captured Emily leaving the house as Sophie ran after her, crying for attention. Another showed her brushing off Sophie's pleas for breakfast, telling her to figure it out because she didn't have time. All of this was compiled and submitted to the court. Early Monday morning, a judge granted a temporary restraining order, awarding me full custody of Sophie until the family court could review the case. Another order barred Emily from contacting Sophie until the matter was resolved. Tom's strategy had worked. The combination of Emily's blatant infidelity and neglect painted a clear picture of someone who had abandoned her family. As I sat in the attorney's office, signing the final documents, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. This wasn't the life I had envisioned for Sophie or myself, but I knew it was the only path forward. Several legal motions were granted almost without question. It's remarkable what a wealthy and influential attorney can accomplish when properly motivated. Of course, I was helping that man, Tom, become even wealthier in the process. By Monday morning, the legal wheels were in full motion, and by the afternoon, the fallout had begun. At Emily's accounting firm, Mondays were notoriously sluggish. Many employees were known to spend their weekends partying hard, dragging their hangovers into work. Others idled at their desks, sipping coffee and chatting, waiting for the drinkers to rejoin the living. The usual hum of office banter was disrupted just after lunch when a large man in a gray suit strode into the building. He was an imposing figure with a commanding presence. Several hopeful women glanced his way as he moved through the aisles, but his focus never wavered. He carried a photograph in his hand, glancing at it periodically as he searched for someone specific. After a few moments, he found her. Emily stood near her supervisor, chatting uncomfortably with two men. One tall and distinguished-looking, the other shorter and wiry, practically glued to her side. She kept trying to shift away from the latter, her dark, troubled eyes betraying her unease. The large man approached unnoticed until his deep, rumbling voice broke the tension. "Emily Bennett?" he asked. She turned, her face paling as she nodded reluctantly. Something haunted her expression, a growing sense of dread. The man reached into his coat and withdrew a thick envelope. "You, madam," he announced loudly, "are served." Heads turned, and the office grew silent. He placed his briefcase on a nearby desk and began removing additional documents, printed on onion skin paper with blue backings. "This," he said, holding up the first set of papers, "is a copy of the divorce petition filed this morning. Mr. John Bennett intends to dissolve your marriage immediately." Emily's lips trembled as she accepted the papers. "These," the man continued, placing another set in her hands, "are court orders prohibiting you from coming within 1,000 feet of the residence you formerly shared with Mr. Bennett." He added another stack to her growing pile. "This is a temporary restraining order forbidding you from contacting Miss Sophie Rio Bennett in any way. You may not call, email, write, or attempt to speak to her. Is that clear, madam?" Emily nodded numbly, her hands shaking. By now, a crowd of co-workers had gathered, murmuring amongst themselves. The man wasn't done. "Mr. Bennett also wants you to know that all your joint account credit cards were canceled 2 hours ago. Your joint checking and savings accounts have been closed, with 50% of the funds allocated to this cashier's check." He held the check by a corner as if it were contaminated, then added it to the stack of documents. "Furthermore," he said, "all your clothing and personal possessions are currently being packed and placed into storage. They will be made available to you at a time and place of your choosing. You may communicate your preferences to Mr. Bennett's attorney at the number provided here." He handed her a business card. He leaned in slightly, his voice lowering for emphasis. "You are not permitted to enter the residence for any reason. The locks have been changed, and the security codes updated." Tears spilled down Emily's cheeks as she clutched the stack of papers, her humiliation on full display. The process server turned to the slender man beside her, who had been inching toward the door. "David Harper," the man boomed, stopping him in his tracks. "Don't go anywhere." David froze, his face going pale. The man retrieved another envelope from his briefcase and slapped it into David's reluctant hand. "You, sir, are served," he declared. "Congratulations. You've been named a correspondent in the matter of Bennett versus Bennett." He withdrew another stapled mass of papers. "You are also the respondent in a civil suit filed this morning by Mr. Bennett for willfully and maliciously interfering in the marriage between John Bennett and Emily Bennett." David staggered, gripping a nearby desk for support. The server's work wasn't finished. He approached Emily's supervisor next, delivering notice of a suit against the firm for failing to enforce its morality clauses. A senior vice president, aware of the affair from the start, was also served in the executive offices. From the back of the room, I watched it all unfold. I felt nothing, not satisfaction, not relief, only cold detachment. My face was expressionless, frozen into unforgiving lines. I'd paid extra for the process server to deliver the cashier's check and legal documents personally, ensuring Emily felt the full weight of her actions. When the realization of what she'd done finally hit her, Emily collapsed to the floor, sobbing. I turned and walked away, my steps steady and deliberate. Later that day, I sat at the head of a long conference table in a dark-paneled room, waiting. Sunlight poured through the windows behind me, casting my face in shadow. The effect was intentional. I lounged in the executive chair, feigning a calm I didn't feel. Emily entered hesitantly, squinting against the light to recognize me. She looked disheveled, her hair now longer than it had been when she worked at the firm. She had cut it short for professionalism, but had since let it grow. "I wanted to see you before the lawyers got involved," she said quietly, pulling out a chair several feet away. It had been nearly 4 months since she'd lost her job and moved in with her brother. Those months had been brutal for me, but they left her visibly worn. I said nothing, my silence stretching into an oppressive weight. She shifted uncomfortably, her usual confidence absent. Whatever she'd planned to say, it wouldn't matter. The path was set, and there was no turning back. Emily looked thinner and moved awkwardly, as though the weight of her guilt was physically crushing her. Her pale face, framed by shoulder-length brunette hair, was shadowed by dark circles that told the story of sleepless nights and poor self-care. My heart ached for her despite everything, but I concealed it behind my corporate CEO mask, the one I usually reserved for handling subordinates and business associates. It was a mask of calm authority, often ruthless and implacable. "And now you're here," I said quietly. She nodded, avoiding my gaze, but eventually, she had no choice but to meet my eyes. "John," she began softly, her voice trembling, "I want to start by saying I'm so sorry for what I've done, to you and to our baby girl." I remained silent, unmoved by her opening plea. "I know it's not enough," she continued, her words faltering. "It doesn't come close to making up for all the pain I've caused, but they're the only words I have." Her voice broke into a whisper. "I'm suffering too, John. I can't understand why I did what I did, and it's driving me insane." She stopped speaking, leaving the silence to grow heavy between us. Finally, I broke it. "I beg to differ," I said evenly, my voice as cold as my expression. "You haven't begun to suffer until you've had to explain to a 3-year-old that her mother might never come home." Emily flinched as if I'd slapped her. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she began sobbing quietly. "It's been 4 months since I had to tell her that," I continued, watching as her sobs grew louder. "And she still cries herself to sleep most nights. Only in the past few weeks have I been able to coax the occasional smile from her." Emily doubled over in her chair, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with grief. "She screams and fights anyone who tries to separate her from me," I added quietly. "If I have to leave her somewhere for too long, she becomes hysterical. She's terrified I won't come back. Can you imagine that fear, Emily? In a little girl who's not even 4 years old?" Emily couldn't respond, her cries overtaking her. I leaned back in my chair, watching her for a long moment before continuing. "She's in a new daycare center here at the corporate campus," I said, forcing my tone to sound cheerful. "I told her I had to build it so I could always be close by. It's helped her, but it's also increased productivity for single parents at the company. It's almost paid for itself already." My attempt at levity fell flat. Emily's tears didn't slow. The silence grew until I finally asked, as gently as I could, "Why? Why did you do it, Emily? I loved you more than life itself, and you ripped my soul out. There's a big, empty place inside me now, and I can't begin to heal until I understand why you did this." Emily shook her head, her tears streaming freely. She hadn't worn makeup, likely anticipating this emotional breakdown. Even so, she was still beautiful, perhaps more so now as a mature 30-year-old woman than when we had married. Watching her cry, my heart broke again. I don't know why, she finally said after a long pause. Maybe I'm insane or something. I've tried to find the reasons, but I can't. She fell silent, her gaze fixed on the grain of the heavy conference table. I can't undo what I've done, she whispered eventually. I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I won't ask for it. I've hurt the only man I ever truly loved, and I'll live with that pain for the rest of my life. Her voice grew softer. I think about our baby girl. I hear my own voice, screaming at you to take her to hell with you. I replay that night in my head, over and over. She stared at the ceiling, her tears slowing as though she had cried herself dry. I'm seeing a counselor, she said slowly, her voice weary. A psychologist. I'm trying to figure out why I destroyed everything. She fiddled nervously with her hands. I even went to see Nancy Harper. I apologized for what I did to her family. I raised an eyebrow, surprised. She was kind to me, Emily mused. I don't know why. She told me David always found some woman at every job. She said she'd gotten used to it, but this time she'd had enough. She's divorcing him and moving on. She's found someone who loves her and her kids, and she says he's the best thing that ever happened to her. I had known Nancy was divorcing David, but I hadn't known Emily had apologized to her. That showed remorse, even a willingness to accept responsibility. For the first time, I felt a small stir of hope, wondering if it might grow into something meaningful. What is your doctor telling you? I asked. Emily glanced at me before dropping her gaze back to the table. We haven't made much progress, she admitted. I wish I could tell you otherwise. All I know is that something changed when I started drinking heavily. Were you drunk the first time? I interrupted, holding her gaze. Her lips trembled as she hesitated. The first time I had sex with David, she asked quietly. Yes, I was drunk. But after that, her voice faltered. Sometimes I wasn't even drunk, John. I don't have that excuse. She began sobbing again, but choked it off quickly. I'm trying to find the real reasons with my counselor, she said softly. The room fell silent again until she spoke hesitantly. John, she began, her voice almost pleading. Would you see my counselor? She wants to talk to you, not about what you think. She just wants to ask you some questions, to see if there's something I've left out. Her words tumbled out in a rush, as if trying to beat an imagined objection. I paused before answering. I suppose, I said simply. Emily blinked, her expression disbelieving. You'll go? She asked, her voice trembling with emotion. I shrugged. I'm still your husband, I told her somberly. I'll do what I can to help you, as long as it doesn't hurt our child. A flicker of hope lit her face. I nearly said something to snuff it out, to remind her there was no real chance for reconciliation. But I stopped myself. For Sophie's sake, I would explore any avenue, even if it led nowhere. Love wasn't something I could turn off like a faucet. I still loved Emily, but that love couldn't erase the deep betrayal I felt. We finalized the divorce 6 months later. I allowed Emily to visit Sophie during and after the divorce, despite my pain. She made several attempts to reconcile, but I knew the marriage was over. Counseling helped me cope, and I adjusted my work schedule to spend more time with my daughter. A year later, Emily left town and married another accountant. Sophie was part of their lives. I was invited to the wedding but chose not to attend. I never remarried, dedicating my life to raising Sophie. She became my world, and together, we built a new life. One marked by resilience, love, and healing.